Hi, Neil Patterson here. Coming up, today's Sky News Daily, helping you get your head around one topic in about 20 minutes. Today, why exactly did the Justice Secretary say prison isn't working for most women? And if you like what you're hearing, you can follow us on your podcast app. Back in just a minute. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sky News Daily. Neil Patterson here, where today we're once again talking prisons, and the problems with the prison estate are well known, aren't they? They are overcrowded, there's violence, there's drugs, there's the early release of offenders to try and create space within the prisons. But of course, all of these complaints are most commonly associated with male prisons. What of the female prison estate? Here's the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood.
We imprison women on minor charges to a far greater degree than men. Around 2/3 did not commit a violent crime, yet they are sent to prisons that are desperate places. Self-harm in women's prisons is 8 times higher than in the male estate. But perhaps worst of all, women's prisons are hurting mothers and they are breaking homes.
Prison isn't working, the words of the Justice Secretary speaking to Labour Party conference in September. I'm joined by our home editor, Jason Farrell. Good to see you, Jason.
Hi, Neil. Good to be here.
Also, Scarlett Roberts herself, an ex-prisoner, now advocating for change in the women's prison estate. Scarlett, lovely to see you too.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Jason, let's start with you. Why are we talking about this? Why is the Justice Secretary so adamant that women's prisons aren't fit for purpose?
Well, she's highlighted it a lot in what she's just said there. She's talking about the difficulty of rehabilitation. That's one issue. Motherhood and the differences that brings for a woman to a man, and the fact that the prison system is set up differently for women because simply there are fewer women in the prison system, therefore fewer prisons, and therefore they have to be further away from their families when they go to prison, and they may not get the same kind of rehabilitation services that are set up for men's prison because there are so many more men going through that system. So those are the fundamentals. And then you look at what happens to women after they come out of prison, and the point that it is twice as hard for women to find work. That is not reflective of the employment situation of women in the country today. So why is it twice as hard for women to find work? And let's not forget that once you're in employment, you're far less likely to reoffend. So it's a really, really important factor. You need a home, you need your family, you need a job. And if you don't get that job, then it's going to be really hard to stay out of the system. Actually, often for women, they end up going into prison for something relatively minor, and then they become a serial offender.
Compare the women's prison estate to the men's prison estate, numbers, locations. I mean, you even have, with women, uncategorised prisons where you get a mixture of prisoners as well.
Scarlett will be able to tell you more about this, but there are 3,600 women currently in the estate, 88,500 men. There are far fewer women's prisons, a dozen, am I right?
There's 12 and only 2 are open, 10 are closed prisons. So women's prisons are either open or closed. Now, for example, an open prison means you'd be let out of your cell around 7 in the morning and locked back in at 7 at night. So in that 12-hour gap, you have access to education, perhaps training courses, apprenticeships. You'd have outside charities coming in to train people. That can only happen in open conditions. So if the majority of women are in closed prisons, we were locked in for 23 hours a day. Women make up only 4% of the prison population, so we're far fewer. Hence, there's only 12 prisons. I mean, for example, if you're a woman who commits an offence and is convicted in Wales, there's no women's prison in Wales. So you're transferred to England to be imprisoned. That's a whole other country that your family would have to travel to. And also resourcing. I mean, if you look at the women's estates, Jason will know because he's visited some of them. We've got the most awful Victorian archaic buildings, and the new builds are all for the men's estate just because there's so many more in number.
Jason, I mean, you were recently inside.
It is interesting. It wasn't what I expected walking into Style. So yes, it's got the same kind of prison surround, but then it's got these old Victorian ex-orphanages that are, I think there's 16 of them, these quite austere houses that have been kind of reconverted into prison blocks and cells. But the program that they had in there, Recycling Lives, which is run by a charity, by the way, it's not run by the MOJ, it's also unexpected. You've got a bunch of women in a far corner of this prison estate in this kind of warehouse area, and it's like walking into a gym. Because they're all at these different stations and they're all smashing up TVs and ripping the plastic from the glass. And and taking out the electronics and putting them all into different bins, recycling those devices that we've all thrown away at the tip. But the idea is that they're recycling their lives because they're learning skills and they're incredible with these tools that they will then take out work in the community. And the Recycling Lives program works that they also have an operation on the outside. So these women can actually move into jobs on the outside. And they have a 6% reoffending rate, which is, hugely lower than the 25% average. And if you're serving less than 12 months, actually the reoffending rate is 50%.
I mean, you actually had a former prisoner running this program as well.
A woman who actually, used to be a prisoner, now has the keys to the prison, a woman called Yvonne Grimes. She's an incredible woman. She describes herself as the mother, sister, doctor, nurse of all these women, psychotherapist, but she's also the shop floor manager. And she runs a type ship and encourages these women to learn these skills. And of course, she's been through it.
Scarlett, where were you?
I was in Eastwood Park in Gloucestershire.
Tell me about it.
Because we're talking about rehabilitation. In the Birdman of Alcatraz, the prisoner asks his jailer, what is the meaning of rehabilitation? And his jailer doesn't know. And he explains it means to reinvest with dignity. What I can tell you for sure, there is no dignity in the incarceration of women in the UK. Being forced to strip naked and defecate in front of strangers, because that's how you share cells with strangers. Being deprived of access to sanitary products and sometimes even toilet paper if they just run out. Being denied access to pain relief and being kept in prolonged periods of pain. For example, when I had COVID, you just weren't given paracetamol in case you overdosed on it. Looking back, it's day by day, you just get on with it because you have no choice. But looking back, it's a deeply dark place to be. And then on top of that, we dispatch women back into the community, jobless and homeless, and expect them to become a better version of the woman we caged 6 months before when we took her away from her own children. I am very fortunate. I have a very close family and a great group of friends, and I had an army. I was also released jobless and homeless, and I was riddled with, I wouldn't diagnose myself, but I was having panic attacks because of the things I'd seen in prison. 2 women ended their lives on the wing in my last week in custody. It's a deeply unpleasant thing to witness. I rehabilitated in spite of the system, not because of it. And then 2 years on, I was awarded a Churchill Fellowship, which is a research fellowship. I'm now able to travel globally and research adolescent mental health outcomes in other countries to implement them here so we have better outcomes here.
So the act of incarceration itself, you suggest, is running counter to the idea of women emerging from the process in a better place.
Prison should be like a scaffolding is to a building, a temporary structure from which to build a stronger foundation. What we do instead is cage a woman, take her out of her home, demolish the home, and then release her into the rubble and see what she does with it.
I suppose, Jason, you heard an awful lot of stuff that will chime with what Scarlett said when you were in Style.
A lot of women who were really struck hard by missing their children. I think another thing is when women, and it's not uncommon for a woman to go in not long after childbirth, and they may have postnatal depression, and they don't have access to the therapy that they might have had out on the outside. They don't have access to medication sometimes. The kind of things you don't think about. A woman who was still wanting to do the night feeds when the baby's not there, and that particular woman said she was then put into a segregation unit. So she's alone with her thoughts on that for 23 hours a day. That's not going to be good for your mental health. I mean, I remember when I met you, Scarlett, talking about self-harm and some of the things you'd seen.
Yeah.
Self-harm amongst the female prison population is much higher.
Was up 63% in a year.
And they won't give you paracetamol, but they'll give you a disposable razor blade every day if you want to shave your legs. And they know that these women are hurting themselves. I would walk the wing and see plasma hanging out of women's arms. If a woman hurts herself, they don't stitch her up or take her to hospital.
You described them giving one woman a bowl.
Yeah, she'd hurt herself so bad, and it was in the night, and the nurse came and she just gave her a bowl for the blood. And then the woman, out of frustration, later on threw the bowl at a member of staff full of blood. And then she had days added onto her sentence as a further punishment. I mean, it's really dark, right? It's very sinister.
One of the striking things I remember actually from meeting you was your diary. And Scarlett had started crossing out the days. And as the weeks went on, the crosses just became thicker and thicker, and until almost they were ripping through the page.
Correct.
And that just, to me, kind of showed how your mental health must have changed.
When it comes to just the prison estate in general, what is, in your mind, the point of sending people to prison?
I think we should only be sending people to prison if they're a danger to the wider public or a danger to themselves or both. Let's not forget that when it does come to sentencing, we mustn't forget the victim must come at foremost, front and centre of any decision made by a sentencing judge. If there is a victim to a crime and or their family too, they must be factored into the length and the severity of the punishment. That cannot be taken away because we must always focus on the victims. But then after that, for example, for me, mine was a crime of dishonesty. It was perverting the course of justice. Did I deserve to take 4 months out of society that ruined my life for the next 2 years? I would argue not. 4 months is long enough to lose your job, your home, and if you have children, they'll be taken into care.
Isn't that equally true for men?
Of course it is. But the difference between men and women here, and I think the wider public don't know this, women's prisons aren't categorised like men's are. So I was in a closed prison because there's 10 closed women's prisons and only 2 open prisons. Well, you have 1 hour to shower, make a piece of toast, have a chat with somebody, anybody, and then you go back into your room again, which is for 2 people, and it's the size of the average bathroom.
Describe to me that cell.
You can't stretch your arms out wide. Even when you look out of a window, there's no sense of the wider world. You can only see directly in front. So it further cements this idea of you are completely locked in. You're not just curtailed from society, but even your vision. You're not even able to see anything.
We have had the Justice Secretary saying that the women's prison estate is not fit for purpose. So what on earth are they doing about it?
Well, they've set up this Women's Justice Board, and actually they haven't done anything yet, but they're making sounds about it. But they are basically saying we're going to reduce the number of women we send to prison. We're going to have more intervention programs to stop women going to prison in the first place. They're going to try and look at community sentences and other things like that. I think the other point the government made, women are often in prison in association with a crime that's been committed around a man. Well, it could be that they were coerced into it. So the woman I met who was working in the area that was recycling lives, she was selling drugs for her partner. 60% of women in prisons are victims of domestic violence, and over 50% have had some form of sexual abuse or other abuse as a child. So the women in prisons are often in relation to something that may have been involving a man. In the words of the Justice Secretary, they are also victims. And so that does kind of, in a way, shed a slightly different light on those kind of prisons. You could say that many men have had difficult times as well, but it is more likely that a woman is going to be the victim of domestic violence and sexual violence than a man. And it is far more likely in the prison population, the female prison population.
Just if this sentencing review takes place, aren't we heading towards a situation, Scarlett, where if someone commits this crime, pick a random offence, a sentencing of 2, 3, 4 years, if a man commits this crime, he ends up going to prison. A woman commits this crime and she doesn't. Is that fair?
Absolutely not. And I would never advocate for that. When it comes to sentencing, it should be absolutely equal between the sexes, men and women. There are sentencing guidelines and they should be applied equally. Sadly, we already know that they're not. Jason, from his investigation, found that women are far more likely to be imprisoned for non-violent offences. 68% of women in prison are there for non-violent offences. I stand by my personal opinion, which, whether it be male or female, if it's a non-violent crime, we need to look at alternatives to custody. Community sentences are by far proven to be more successful in reducing recidivism than prison is. So whether it be male or female, they should be sentenced to the same time and severity of punishment. Well, the problem, like I said before, with women's prisons is that there is no choice to put women in an open prison. So if the choice is imprisonment for a non-violent crime, but you're putting a woman in a closed prison, the same as women who've committed murder, Is that fair? Because men don't face that. If men commit murder, they go to a high security prison category A. If they've committed a crime of dishonesty like fraud, they'll go to a category D open prison. They're out of their cell for 12 hours a day where they've got access to be able to write an email, to be able to make a phone call, to talk to an officer and say, I need access to a local charity who can help me find employment on release. So if you're enclosing women for 23 hours a day, they don't have the opportunity to try and build some foundations for their release. It's not about sentencing them differently. It's about resourcing, ultimately. You've got to provide the same provision in prison for women as you do for men. And currently we don't.
Do both of you get the impression that the government is taking this seriously?
Yeah, I mean, James Timpson, the prison minister, obviously he's been big into the whole rehabilitation concept, employs thousands of prisoners to work in his key cutting and shoe making repair shops. And he comes with that attitude, the same attitude actually that is shown by Recycling Lives, this programme we saw in Preston and Manchester. And they certainly feel there that he's the kind of guy who could bring in this reform.
Are we getting to a point where actually, such is the extent of the problems with the prisons estate, particularly the female estate, but also the men's, that we just need to go back to square one? We need to tear up the blueprint and redo everything.
I'd say yes, but that should apply to men too. We can't go down this road of segregating between men and women. It's simply unfair. But we must focus on women first because currently their conditions are much more severe.
I think the government is looking at this. I mean, already we're talking about ending short sentences per se of up to 12 months. And this is what actually the focus is, that most women are on short sentences, so they kind of fall into that category anyway. I think the really important thing is around work. I remember 10-15 years ago when Los Angeles had a massive crime problem and they had lots of people in gangs and stuff like that. And I met this pastor whose project that he set up actually transformed getting people out of gangs by getting gang members into work. They had massive gun violence, huge number of people dying in Los Angeles. And his motif was nothing stops a bullet like a job, And and so I think it's great that focus on how do we rehabilitate people, we get them homes, we get them back to their families, and we get them work.
Scarlett, final word from you. How much of your time in prison do you still carry with you?
Every day, because I won't stop until these women's needs have been met. Nobody is equal to the worst mistake they've ever made. In much the same way, nobody is the sum of the best work they ever do. We can't keep reducing people to the crimes they commit. They've served their time in prison. They've served their punishment. We have to focus on getting them back into society to have a meaningful existence.
Scarlett, Jason, great to see both of you. We asked the Ministry of Justice about Scarlett's account of what she saw at HMP Eastwood Park. At the time of publication, the department hadn't responded to those claims, but any update we get will go straight into our notes for the episode. And that is your lot for this edition of The Daily. If you want to see Jason's reporting, simply head to skynews.com. We're back again, same time tomorrow.